Thank you very much. Welcome to our very special seminar, and there's actually a tradition to it in economics at this time of the week. We usually would have the brown bag seminar, and instead of you needing to bring a brown bag, you actually get the food in the seminar. So that's the reason why we insisted.
Can you tell me how to make this quiet? Like down, it should be down here, but the whole screen's, oh, that one. Exit full screen. And we go on that, and then we make them like that loud.
Like if you are with us via Zoom, can you make sure you are muted? We can mute you from here as well, and that's what Sam just does. Thank you. So welcome again. I just tried to talk a little bit about why we feed you while you're here, that there is a long ongoing tradition there. But I think most of the reason is not the food, but the talk. And this is something that I particularly like about this talk. This is a joint initiative with, now I hope I get that right, Health, Safety and the Environment from QUT and the BEST Center, that's Behavioral Economics, Science and Technology. The Health, Safety and Environment group sits in HR, that's correct, right? No. Okay, they're in Student Services and Wellbeing, but it's one of the initiatives to make us all feel better. I could start again to talk about food, but I won't. I want to talk about Roy a little bit, and it's actually pretty tough to talk about Roy. So I thought I'd start with what economists are good at, and I talk about numbers. And Roy is actually aware of numbers as well, I was made aware. So if you look for his work, you actually find out he has about 250,000 citations to his work. So one of the ways that economists look at these numbers, or not economists, every academic says, well, that's an easy way to find out the contribution that an individual makes, and it is quite impressive with Roy. If you look a little bit further, you can even find out that the topics are pretty cool. We have done a little bit of work, for example, on economics and sex. You would not think that's something what that goes well with each other, but it does. and actually, I would say there's a lot of debt owed to that research in BEST to Roy's work, who actually looked as a psychologist at economics to understand sex slightly better. Recently he has done a lot of work on the self, and are we good or bad? That will be something we will hear about. I like this type of titles to ask whether the good is better than the bad in people. I think I'm still maybe more a dreamer there. You seem to have done the research and it seems to be bleak, but we can work together on solutions how to do that. I just looked at the books that are somehow currently in circulation. There seem to be 7 books out there that get still pretty high ranked. So there's a lot of work, not only in articles, but really in books, and it's worthwhile reading them, I guess. The current work is very much on self and self-control. I don't know whether we hear a bit more about that today, but I look forward to the talk and then hopefully a very interesting discussion. Again, if you are joining online, please mute yourself for now. There is a chance to ask questions after the talk. Just raise your hand and then we can see it on the screen here, and or add your question in the chat and then somebody will shout it out here. Roy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So my talk today is based on a project I did about 20 years ago, and we just did a book on it to bring it up, but those are the only 2 publications. It's not part of a general program of research. It's something I sort of stumbled onto, and became very interested. The basic idea, and this is the title of the review article published 20 years ago, is that bad is stronger than good. So the idea is that the human mind reacts more strongly to bad things than good things. And as I'll run through some of the examples, this is true for behavior, for emotions, for thought processes. It seems to be extremely broad. It's one of those things where I started to notice the pattern here and there, and gradually developed it and started seeing, had no inkling that it was as broad as it turned out to be. So I've come to think it's not a specific reaction to a particular thing, but a basic principle about the structure of the mind. It's also sometimes called the negativity effect, negativity bias. It's true in psychology. My co-author on the book, John Tierney, was a journalist, and he said he had come around by a circuitous route to a similar impression in his career as journalism. He recalled writing the first story of his career, the first assignment, and it was about a heat wave. And so people were driving to the coast, so there was a huge traffic jam. And his editor pushed him to write it up that there's a traffic crisis developing from the heat crisis. And so he did, and the story did well and got him on the front page and so on. But anyway, why does everything have to be a crisis? But that's what sells papers. And over the years, I mean, he's basically optimistic. And although the title of our book, The Power of Bad, and Bad is Stronger Than Good, this is basically an optimistic message. And you might think positive psychology people would hate me for this, but it actually is a reason why we need more positive psychology. And so it's been very popular with them as well. Anyway, John said he noticed over time that life is getting better by almost every, at least in the Western world. I mean, there's Ukraine and a few places, but in our societies, life gets better decade after decade by almost every measure except hope. People think things are getting worse. And they're even hopeful for their own life. They say it's getting better. They just think society in general is going downhill. But there's this endless flow of alarmist stories in the news and books predicting disaster, and people eat that stuff up. That's what sells, and creates this impression of impending, if not ongoing disaster. It also explains perhaps why positive psychology was a rather late emerging movement in the history of research in psychology, because you could say, well, maybe psychologists just hate people and they're looking for bad things, and we want to study what's wrong with them and all that. But a more charitable characterization would be that they were a new science, methods are needing to be developed, and there's a lot of error variance because people are different. So to get published and get tenure, which is what professors worry about, they need to study strong effects. And the bad effects being stronger, they were easier to get bad effects in the laboratory or in your research project than positive ones. And so it wasn't until really the 90s when Martin Seligman took over as a president of American Psychological Association that he started this initiative. And it wasn't even his first idea. He tells the story. His plan when he was president, you're only president for 1 year, and you get to have one initiative that you take psychology in a new direction. His idea would be therapy based on research evidence. And he's going to produce this innovation to switch clinical psychology to have a stronger research footing. And he pursued that for several months, and all the clinicians said, no, what if the evidence doesn't support what we do? We don't like that. So to hell with evidence. And so positive psychology he came around to in the middle of his term as a second choice of something to do. All right. Well, as I said, this is a pattern that I sort of stumbled into by accident. There are two areas where they had sort of noticed this effect, that bad is stronger than good. And so the researchers somewhat in these two areas had noticed it there, although they hadn't put it together with other things or even with each other. But in psychology, impression formation research had known for a long time, if you meet somebody new, you find out something bad about them, it has a bigger effect on your total impression than if you find out something good about the person. And indeed, there are even lovely mathematical models for what you think of a person based on, what their traits are. They had people rate the quality of traits, some good traits and some bad traits, and give them a mathematical weighting. And they said, okay, we can just do this and put them all together. When you combine them, then your impression of the person will be the average of all these traits. And they did this, and it never worked. The impression was always more negative than the average of the traits would be, because the negative traits had a stronger effect on your global impression. Meanwhile, in economics, there was loss aversion. I was discovered you're more upset about losing $100 than you're happy about gaining $100. And so investment plans and other decisions are biased because the possibility of something bad happening has a bigger impact on the decision than the possibility of something good happening. It's irrational. It departs from the pure rational traditional economic models. And again, was a puzzling phenomenon, but again, found in many different contexts. My own work stumbled on it in some different ways. Early in my career, I would study the effects of success and failure on task performance. So I'd have people come to the laboratory and work on a task, and then randomly, I would tell them that they succeeded or failed and look at the consequences. And it seemed to emerge that telling them they failed had a bigger effect in terms of changing their feelings or thoughts or behaviors than telling them that they succeeded. If you had a neutral control, you can compare success, failure, neutral control. The success maybe was a little better than the neutral control, but the failure was a bigger departure from it. And later on, in another line of work, people's desire to connect with others, belongingness and interpersonal connection, we started testing that in the laboratory by giving people messages of you being socially accepted or socially rejected, again, with also a neutral control group. And it was the same thing. The acceptance, we boosted people a little. Acceptance is a little bit nicer, but acceptance and no feedback were about the same usually, whereas rejection really sent people crazy and produced much bigger effects. So that was an early hint for me. Network was just starting when I was collecting the information for the original Bad is Stronger Than Good paper. So I started looking around, saying, oh, there are a couple things that are parallel there. And so my plan was recruit a couple colleagues, students, and we'd survey different areas and find out where this is true and where it's not true. And that would give us an idea of why and when this effect occurs, that bad is stronger effect. So we look at a variety of things. Let me run through some of them. So there are these diary studies where each day people record what happens to them and how they feel. Well, not surprisingly, if you have a good day, you feel good. If you have a bad day, you feel bad. But what they also noticed was that, okay, you have a good day, you feel good, but then the next day you start over. Whereas if you have a bad day, you feel bad, and that carries over into the next day. So the effects of bad things are more lasting in terms of statistically influencing your moods on the subsequent day for a longer period of time than the good ones. Likewise, bad events seem to have more emotional reactions, change how people adjust to things, change their general outlook. A variety of effects went with sort of everyday good and bad events, with the bad ones having a stronger effect. Major life changes. The idea of the hedonic treadmill goes back to the 1970s, famous study of looking at people who had won a lottery and come into a large sum of money. Those were the good ones. Or people who had been in a serious crash and had lost the use of some of their arms and legs, basically been crippled for life. And sure enough, being crippled produced a negative reaction, and winning the lottery produced a positive reaction. A year later, they said many of those reactions had worn off, and people were back more toward neutral. And so the idea, the hedonic treadmill, is like you're walking on a treadmill, you keep moving, but you're still in the same place. So they said, well, your emotional states, regardless of what happens, are staying pretty much the same. But finally, some researchers said, come on, is this really so true? I mean, yes, everything wears off and people adjust to some degree to things. But it's a very massive project in Germany. And sure enough, the really bad things do have a longer lasting effect. That if you win a lot of money, but a year later, you may not feel any happier because of that, partly because you've spent a fair amount of it. You've discovered a lot of relatives that you didn't know you had, asking for money and making demands and so on. Whereas being crippled really does have a lasting negative effect. And yes, it's worst at first and it does wear off to some degree. But again, the really bad life-changing event takes much longer to get over and sometimes never really fully gets over it. Trauma. It occurred to me during this, trauma is a familiar concept in psychology. That's a single event that produces a negative reaction that has a lasting effect on your psychology. I noticed there's no opposite concept. We don't even have a word for a single positive event that will have a lasting positive effect on you. And so there may not be one. Usually when I talk about this, somebody brings up, what about spiritual transformations? That's my best bet for it, but I haven't found any data yet. I've been looking for this. I like the idea that there must be exceptions at some point. I had a paper I was asked to review some years ago, and people were talking, saying, "Oh, this is great," but it was just a bunch of anecdotes. They had no data for it, so it was kind of disappointing. Seligman himself has pointed out to me it's kind of a tragedy that the post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is real and does happen to people, that gets all the media attention. And so people now, when they have a trauma, they're starting to expect that they will have PTSD. Whereas he says a fair amount of data show that more people experience post-traumatic growth than the stress syndrome. So yeah, trauma is a bad thing for sure. But people learn from it and they deal with it and they change their lives, and sometimes they realize what's important or whatever. There are many positive effects that aren't really known. And so he says the emphasis on the stress, which again is real, it's not to diminish the suffering of those people, but other people might start to expect it now, and then other people around them will expect them to have it when they go through a trauma. And that's perhaps unfortunate. It's pushing people into having more negative reactions. With sex, you see the same thing. Again, bad experiences, bad sexual experiences have a fairly lasting effect on one's sex life. A good sexual experience, no matter how good you are, you can't just make love to somebody one time and have their life be transformed in a positive way afterwards. People who study relationships notice the pattern there with sex. As we say, the good sex, positive sexual experiences, yes, they do strengthen a relationship, but they account for 15 to 20% of the variance in satisfaction in the relationship. Whereas if the sex is bad, there's a much bigger effect, 50 to 75% of the variance in relationship satisfaction there. I also just recently published some work looking at what happens over the course of a marriage. This is inspired by the Australian journalist Tina Arndt in her book called The Sex Diaries, which she thought she'd have a bestseller by having couples keep records of their sex lives. And there were some juicy anecdotes, to be sure, in there. But a lot of it was about the man begging for sex and the woman saying, no, or keep that thing away from me was a memorable line. And so I asked my relationship colleagues, is this a general pattern? Tina in her book said, something seems to make women go off sex when they settle into a relationship. I asked my relationship colleague, is that known in the literature? Is this a real thing? And they said it's not known in the literature, but we have data where they had tracked married couples over 5 years and measured their sexual desires, not just the activity. And sure enough, it was a pattern. And the relevant thing is that as the woman's interest in sex went down over the first few years, both of them became less satisfied with the marriage. And they did time lag analysis and everything. And so it's the sex changes first, and the change in relationship satisfaction comes later. I'm trying to get the message out because I think people blame themselves and blame each other for this, and that damages the relationship. People should just realize this is a normal thing. It's probably not that marriage is bad for sex, which I also don't want to send that message out, but that just nature is arranged for female sex drive to increase during the courtship phase to help cement the union. And so it's normal and natural to return to baseline, and it's not a sign that something's wrong with the relationship, but it often materializes that way. More generally about relationships, when researchers ask people, well, how's your marriage and so on, they commonly say, oh, it gets better and better. It's better every year. But the researchers don't find any actual sign of that if they track people over time. Relationships, I mean, after all, they start off on a high. You don't marry somebody you hate. Um, so they start off in a positive thing, and then there are two pathways. The relationship either stays pretty good or it goes downhill. And hence the impact for having a good marriage is to avoid the things that start it to go downhill, that start the downward spiral. And again, that's important news. So some of the early studies looked at how couples solve problems. There are constructive solutions like talking about it or simply affirming your loyalty to the person. I don't agree with you, but I still love you and all that. And then there are destructive things like withdrawing or fighting or throwing things or going out and finding someone else. Anyway, yes, the constructive things make the relationship stronger, the destructive things make it weaker, but the destructive things have a bigger statistical impact. If you track the relationship and look at it, it's the sum of the destructive things they do. And in particular, what had a huge effect was the destructive responses to other destructive responses. So one person starts asking bad, in a good marriage, I've heard people say things like, what matters is for the one partner to say, you've been really negative and hard to live with for a while, and you need to stop that pretty soon before I start responding in the same vein. So that when you're both responding negatively and destructively, that really accelerates the downward spiral. Reciprocating bad things is particularly potent. Another line of work, Gottman was a famous relationships researcher, died a couple of years ago. He filmed people, tracked them over time, got reports and things, and he found the same sort of thing. It was the destructive things that people do, the negative things that have a much bigger impact on even just whether they stay together, but also if they do stay together on their level of marital satisfaction. And it seems to be the ratio. The F rule, which is a bit of a caricature of his theory, but it worked. I think it originated a group of relationships researchers where we're having dinner together and somebody said, I got this great data set. We can see who stays together and who doesn't. And so what do you think is going to matter? And they thought, well, they have to have the same religious beliefs or political agreement or whatever. And what somebody came up with that won the debate was the ratio of how often they have sex to how often they fight. So the F rule in polite company I describe as 5 fornications for every fight. And if there's a 5-to-1 ratio, then the relationship's likely to survive. A 2-to-1 is not really good enough, even though you're having twice as many. And I don't mean to say there's something magical about having sex, although there may be, but it's easier to measure. If we ask you how many positive interactions do you have, well, they don't know. I asked him to pass the salt, and he did. Does that count? But they can usually say how many times they had sex and how many times they fought in the past week or the past month. And the crucial thing is it works for couples who hardly ever do either. Maybe one fight a year, but have sex every other month. And it works for couples who do that much in a week. Have a fight every week and have sex 5 days, as long as the ratio is 5-to-1 there. And in general, we'll come to it looks like 3 or 4 is generally the break-even point for good to bad. If you try to quantify how much stronger bad is than good, it's weaker with cash and money, but other sorts of things around 4 seems to be there. One more thing in terms of negative effects, some people are more sensitive to them than others. There's a cool study that John Holmes and Sandra Murray did, where they wanted to put a brief relationship threat into there and see if they responded by withdrawing, by lessening their commitment to it. It's hard to do this, but they came up with a clever procedure where they'd have the couple come into the lab and say, we need you to fill out these questionnaires first. We only have the one room, so you're going to have to sit in the same room, but sit back to back. Don't talk to each other. It'll mess up the study if you say anything. You can't talk about your answers. We need independent responses. And so they sit there and they think they're doing the same questionnaire. And the one, there's some demographic stuff, and then it says, tell us something bad about your partner. Actually, there's a list of 20 lines or something, but at least one thing about your partner that really bothers you. And if you have several, I'll list those. And so person goes, okay, and you think, and you say something bad about your partner. Meanwhile, your partner their second page says, list all the objects in your living room. And so partner starts writing there. So you do your thing. You mentioned hesitantly the one bad thing about your partner. And you hear your partner writing and writing and writing and writing. And you're not allowed to talk and so on. And then they collect those. Anyway, what they found is that particularly people with low self-esteem are prone to then devalue the relationship. Just the idea that your partner has some negative feeling, this produces negative effects. And again, listing positive things about your partner is a much weaker effect on commitment to the relationship. Learning, something we care about in universities. Well, reward and punishment are two of the standard ways that people learn, going back to even the studies with rats that dominated the first half century of psychology research. And in general, although the idealists in education would like to think, well, we can get good results just by praising children for what they do correctly, and the same with students and adults. But actually, people learn faster with punishment. I mean, you get the most learning and the fastest if you have both. And I've experienced, my dissertation mentor was one of those people whose educational philosophy was that if the criticism is really thorough, you don't have to bother praising the student. You dispense with saying anything positive. I think I remember all 4 positive things he ever said to me. But it does work. And they're nice controlled studies. For example, they'll give children in one condition a jar, and every time they get an answer right, they get a marble to put in it that they get to keep. Or they give them a jar full of marbles, and every time they get one wrong, they take a marble out. Well, the children learn faster when they started with the full jar, when they're losing marbles, than when they're getting marbles. So again, punishment has a stronger effect than reward. Now, I want to say there are other reasons to be skeptical of punishment, because it may create side effects. Harsh punishment seems unfair, creates negative attitudes and rebellion and all that. But purely in terms of how fast you learn more from criticism and punishment than from praise and reward. There was even one study that took it a step further and studied the teachers. This was, I think, in Chicago in the US, where they're trying to get, in public schools, they're trying to get the students to pass the test that they were at least competent for their grade level at the end of the year. So they said, well, let's give incentives to the teachers. And they managed to get approval to do this as a random assigned study. So some teachers were told at the end of the year, if such and such a % of your students pass the test, you'll get a bonus in your salary, several $1,000s. And the others, in the other condition, they were given the several $1,000s at the beginning of the year and said, if this percentage doesn't pass the test, you have to pay it back. So it's the same incentive, the same criterion, everything the same, but the students did better when the teachers got the money up front and worried about having to pay it back at the end of the year than the other way around. So the greater power of punishment works even for the instructor. I'm not a brain expert, but other people are, and they say the brainwave measurements and so on show the same thing. The brain reacts more strongly to negative things than the positive ones. There's often concern about how to help people cope with fears and so on. They say the fear responses don't disappear in the brain. The person learns to cope with them and live with them and not overreact. But the response, once there, remains there fairly permanently. There's studies where people look at the faces in the crowd and they're quicker to notice the one angry looking face in there that stands out than, say, a happy face. So the brain is attuned to look around a group and pick up negative cues, even in a complex environment. Looking to emotions, I saw this cartoon, I thought it was cute. It's not quite so bad with humans. But again, emotions are much more oriented toward negative things, even though people experience more positive than negative feelings. And as I said, life is mostly good. But the bad words, the bad emotions, we have more words for them. There are more different types. They're better differentiated. So the most common words are emotion words. There's the one happy, and then angry, afraid, and sad. are three others, and any list, and it's true in multiple languages as well, that people have more words for negative than positive emotions. People have more strategies for regulating their feelings. I mean, you want to feel good, right? You want to stop feeling bad. Well, people have far more strategies for stopping to feel bad, getting out of a negative state, than they have for inducing a positive state, even though they're there. Again, it's sort of parallel to the positive psychology thing. The first concern had to be to deal with people who are having crises and problems and mental illness and get them to neutral. And then later on, we had the idea, well, then let's cultivate the positive beyond that. Psychology's job doesn't end when people feel nothing. Memory, likewise, emotionally negative things have more memory impact and leave a stronger taste. They predict future emotions. How do you think you will feel? These things, if such and such happened, how long would you feel good? How long would you feel bad? So people especially exaggerate. If this bad thing happened, it would take me a long time. Look at all sorts of things like, so you got a divorce or you lost your job or whatever. People say, well, I'd be devastated. It would take years to get over it. And, it's a bad thing, but they do get over it much faster. So they predict positive things. There's one nicely controlled study where students wanted to be in this particularly nice dormitory. And so it was a lottery and was randomly assigned. And they asked them, well, how long would you be happy if you get picked for it? How long would you be unhappy if you didn't get it? And they thought they'd be unhappy for much longer if they lost the lottery than they'd be happy if they won. In the event, there wasn't that much of a difference. They got the dorm or not, and then they ceased to have emotions about it. But the prediction was, that would ruin the whole year if I don't get into this dormitory. Propinquity. This is one of the classic studies in psychology. Way back in the 1950s, the Stanford Psychology Department made a deal with one of the housing office there. There was a married student dormitory. It was going to have all new people in there. So they said, well, let's see who becomes friends. So they got everybody, all the couples who moved in there, and to fill out questionnaires.
Look, I'm just in a seminar at the moment. Yeah, bring me back when you come back from shopping.
Okay. Anyway, they wanted to see what leads people to become friends, and they had all these elaborate theories about the similarity of religious beliefs and attitudes and hobbies and all that stuff. And it turned out that the biggest predictor of who became friends was who lived next door. You became friends with the people kind of on the same level as you did. The people who lived by the stairs had a few more friends because they met people going up and down the stairs. And so this became a classic, that just being exposed to people makes you more likely to become friends, and it is true. It's in all the textbooks. 20 years later, somebody followed it up to see if they could replicate it, and they did. But they also included a measure of who became enemies. And it turns out living near someone makes you also more likely to become their enemy, and the enemy effect is stronger than the friend effect. Because, somebody next door is annoying you with their loud music or whatever. So hostility develops. It's, again, the psychological exposure, being near each other, contact on a regular basis, it's a multiplier. It's not a cause of positive per se, it's just a multiplier. So you become slightly more likely to be friends and a lot more likely to become enemies. Social support, something psychology studied a great deal. Yes, it's good having people who like you and visit you in the hospital and so on. You recover faster from injuries if you have more people visit you. There are all those effects. But then at some point they started looking at, well, are there people in your social world who are undermining you, who are making your life difficult and so on? And that has bigger effects on your well-being and your adjustment. So they're both real effects. But again, the negative one is stronger. Parenting, this is a concern, and over the years it's escalated. I think partly as families got smaller, parents became more perfectionistic about wanting to do everything right. When you have 7 kids, well, you just want to have them be fed and so on. But so there's more and more emphasis on how to be super good. And here's the Onion summarizing the line of research. But in terms of what it shows, that really at the negative end, you can mess your kids up. But at the positive end, you can't have that, trying to be perfect as a parent is sort of a self-destructive and a doomed endeavor. The famous developmental psychologist Sandra Scar said, don't try to be a perfect mother, just try to be a good enough mother. We should get that out there, that if you're in the top 95%, that's all you need to worry about. The bottom 5%, maybe 10% or whatever, again, you can do bad things and you can mess your kid up long range, but trying to be perfect isn't going to make your child turn out any better than if you're just kind of average and okay. So don't drive yourself crazy. More systematic research on such as children's intelligence have an interesting finding that at higher levels, higher socioeconomic status or higher quality parenting, higher quality parenting, what that does is then the genetic causes of intelligence are the main factor, that the genetic contribution accounts for most of the variance. At the bottom end, the genetic effect is considerably weaker. So what this means is if you're a bad parent, you can lower your kid's intelligence. But if you're a good one, you can't make your kid any smarter. The good parenting just allows the genes to do their work and to shine through. So again, the bottom is the bad is what has the stronger effect. I like this one. Just be good enough and be satisfied with that. All right, how am I doing on time? Bad news in terms of cognitive information processing. Bad news gets more attention. Thought something bad happens, people search for meaning, they try to understand it. Now, some researchers said, well, is this just expectancies? Because mostly things are good, and so the bad things will stand out because they're unexpected. And that's true. Unexpected events do get more thought and more processing, starting with more attention, more why did this happen, and so on. But it's an orthogonal effect. It doesn't account for the bad is stronger than good in this case. So they manipulate expected bad, expected good, and unexpected good. And the unexpected bad things get by far the most processing. But there's a main effect for bad things independent of the expectancy aspect. Morality, I think we can appreciate that pretty easily. A couple bad deeds have a strong effect on your moral reputation. It's sort of the question of, if you killed somebody, how many good deeds would you have to do to erase it, to be considered a good person again? A liar isn't someone who lies all the time. I say, I only lie twice a day. But a few lies are enough to impugn your honesty for a long period of time. Telling the truth once or twice isn't going to have any kind of similar effect. Research on stereotypes shows the same thing. Negative stereotypes form very easily and take a lot more contrary evidence to overcome than positive stereotypes. There certainly are positive stereotypes, but again, they are weaker, and the negative ones have much more impact. In terms of social strategies, we studied this in our lab and others. People want to protect themselves against failure and enhance their credit, their successes and their credit for successes. Those are both there. Sometimes, like trying to do a good job on the test, it's the same thing. But sometimes those are opposed to each other. I recall walking with a colleague across a public square in Amsterdam, where they had those giant chess boards built into the pavement, and people are playing chess with pieces, this big, where you move them around and stuff, and people are standing around watching. My colleague said, why would anyone do that? I said, well, no, it's a nice way to test your skills and then so on. But you could look so stupid. Well, that's the self-protection strategy. Don't take a chance. Don't put yourself out there with a real chance of failure. Obviously, the guys who were doing it were more focused on, if I go out and win the game, I'll look really good and have a nice experience. So undertaking risky endeavors is is something where you do more if you have an enhancement focus than a protection focus. Anyway, it seems the protection focus is more widespread. Everybody's concerned about protecting against failure. The desire to enhance success is more limited to some people, and many people have both, as I said, but the protection is more common. All right, so that's a sample. That doesn't even exhaust the list. But as I said, we wanted to find the exceptions because that will tell us when this is true and when it isn't. Only we really couldn't find exceptions. We've looked over the years. I've had a variety of people say, "Oh, I think I found an exception," but then it doesn't really come through. I would like to get some. It would make the theory more interesting, but we just couldn't find any areas. We had the researchers we did it. We all had our pet theories, like maybe bad things are stronger in the past, but good things will be stronger in the future. But no, none of them panned out. So that was kind of disappointing in terms of making an interesting, complicated theory here. But some of the disappointment was compensated by thinking, well, this is such a basic property of the mind that it seems to happen everywhere. And when it's that basic, you start to think this must be something that evolved. Indeed, there is evidence for bad being stronger than good, even in some animal behavior. It's harder to test that. Like rats will pull harder to escape a punishment, and they'll pull toward getting a reward, and they'll learn faster and accelerate faster and so on. So one way we started thinking about this, why would this have evolved this way? And we put it as life has to win every day, death only has to win once. So it's useful for the mind to have an orientation to watch out for bad things and minimize bad things. Maximizing good things would be nice too, but that's a second concern. If you miss out on something good, well, that's unfortunate, but it's not a disaster. If you miss out on something bad, you could be dead. So more important than food, food research shows some of the same things. Indeed, one of the big challenges to the existing literature on animal learning, which said that the reward or punishment has to come within half a second of the stimulus. But they found if animal ate something and then was poisoned, and it was made sick by radiation 2 hours later, they would still not like food with that taste. And this just shocked the community. They had to replicate the research multiple times, but it's true. I sort of put it this way. Well, imagine you never had fish until you were 15 or 20 or whatever, and then you had 4 meals. 2 of them were just delicious, sublime, the most wonderful fish tastes you ever had, and made you happy and satisfied and full. And 2 of them were just awful and made you puke your guts out and sick and so on. So it's 2 to 2. Is that like even? No, you'll never eat fish again. So again, it shows the greater power of bad things. There's my evolution image. All right, just to move ahead to some of the new things is probably things that my co-author John Tierney brought up in the book we published a year or 2 ago. The media try to boost sales by emphasizing the negative. It's why there's so much bad news and made clear everywhere. And again, it's easy to blame the media, but they're just a business. They're trying to make money, so they give people what they want, and so it's not them that's the responsible. They are giving us what will sell. Politicians, the same thing. They're trying to win votes by scaring you. You hear a lot more about how bad it'll be if the other side wins than how great it'll be if our side wins. And negative campaigning. We complain about it and people say, well, we're not going to do it anymore, but they always do it because it works, emphasizing what's awful about the other person. The idea of safety addiction is a fairly recent concept. John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, what was it, The Coddling of the American Mind, that especially these days, and it comes with that perfectionistic parenting. You hear stories about a child being abducted or something, and then in America, people don't let their kids walk home from school or walk home from the park. When I was a kid, all the parents would just send us out to play and be home when the street lights come on, and we had to deal with things and get along. But now you raise your child, everything is supervised. You make dates to play with a particular person on a particular occasion, and the parents are sort of there in case there's a problem. And it's one of the explanations why modern college students are so much more afraid, at least in the US, of hearing ideas that'll challenge what they believe, demanding to be protected from all sorts of ideas that might be threatening. It's because they've been brought up by parents that were exaggerately concerned about their safety, what they call safety addiction. And it comes from, again, the media emphasis on that, which is the good news doesn't sell, and the safety of it isn't there. Environmental movement, we see much the same thing. I mean, I don't know what you believe, but sort of, of course, share the usual belief. We want to take care of our physical environment and pass it on to future generations in good shape. But environmentalists have been alarmists predicting imminent disaster, starting with, I think, the early 1960s book, Silent Spring, that pretty soon there aren't going to be any more birds because of pesticides. And they'll all be poisoned. Well, we still have birds. And many predictions of imminent disaster. The population was going to increase, and by the mid-1970s, people would be starving. Millions of people would die because there's not enough food. Well, that never happened. We have more food than ever. Predictions of one disaster after another, and yet none that comes true. And yet the alarmism doesn't seem to go away. They're still predicting imminent environmental disaster that needs urgent. So anyway, my point is it somewhat should seemingly undercut the credibility of the environmental movement. At least we don't have to pay so much attention to the worst case scenarios, since they hardly ever come true. Tierney himself had a bet with an economist who was saying we're going to run out of these precious metals, and the prices will skyrocket. And so he said, okay, well, you pick the 5 metals, anything you want, and we'll see in 25 years if the price has gone up or gone down. We don't have to even have a global shortage, just has the price going up or down. And all 5 of them went down. The guy picked them, and sure enough, he died just before he had to pay the bet. So John didn't collect. But you're making all these alarmist predictions of imminent disaster. Put your money where your mouth is. And so the guy did, to his credit. But he would have lost had he lived it. Again, none of the disasters that he formalized with the bet came true. So on the bright side, life is actually good. As I said, mostly getting better in one, quality of life, quantity of life, longevity, technology, and so on. So yeah, bad things are psychologically stronger, but our message is fairly positive. There's a lot of good things, and you need a lot of small good things to overcome the few negative things. And so again, that's a need for positive psychology. Let's encourage a lot of small positive experiences. One-to-one, the good doesn't match up with the bad. But lots of good ones do. As I said, looks like 3 or 4 to 1 is about the break-even point. So try to get a little bit more than that. We make this in terms of relationship advice too. Don't think, oh, I annoyed my spouse yesterday, so I should do something nice for him or her to make it up today. Instead think, no, I should do 4 good things to make it up and repair the damage. For the relationships, as I said, give priority to avoiding the negative as well. There's always this issue, for leadership and so on, when you have to deliver evaluations. How do you do it? Well, delivering criticism is always a problem. The one doesn't want to say it, the other doesn't want to hear it. So you start off with the good news and finally get around to the other. But people who study those things, there's a fair amount of evidence that the person receiving the feedback is hearing the good stuff and yeah. They don't even pay attention. They want to know what the bad stuff is. 80 and 90% of people, you say, I have some good news and some bad news. People just say, okay, start with the bad news. Tell me that. And then they hear that. And then they're really anxious to hear the good stuff, then they'll really appreciate it. So there are different strategies, but one that's probably user-centered is start with, okay, this is the biggest negative, this is the problem, and then come out for the good stuff. John has this term, the crisis. that there's always so many crises that we keep producing more of them. And so the idea is there will always be more crises. None of them in general are as bad as people are saying. So the crises tend to be overstated. There's a lot of anguish and hand-wringing and so on, that, oh my, isn't it awful? But it's probably not as awful as it says. I mean, it may be bad, but it's not totally as bad as it. And the solution may make things worse. That what you do in response to it, because of this, you've exaggerated the crisis, may cause more trouble than the problem. And COVID, example, which Tierney has been writing about in the media, focuses on the American case, but worldwide it's a lot of a similar story. The American media were much more negative about COVID even than other countries, and it's probably because the media are more competitive in America. There's no state-run media, and it's a big country, so there's a lot of information, and so they have to compete for consumers, for eyeballs, and so emphasizing the bad things is a way to grab people's attention. So, like when it was time to start reopening the schools, it's clear kids didn't learn that much staying at home, no surprise. And so, well, hardly the ones that let the kids back into the classroom, did they get sick? No, kids really didn't suffer much from COVID, nor did they even, in general, infect their parents. But did the news media emphasize that? No, they would find a single case where a kid, got COVID and ended up in the hospital or something like that. So again, the media featuring the bad thing, but that's again what people want to read about, not what's actually really quite good news, that it's pretty safe, let the kids are back in there. There's just a big meta-analysis that the lockdowns versus not lockdowns, the COVID course was pretty much the same, that the lockdowns seem to have done little or no good. It's again with the idea that the response may be worse or cause more problems than the original crisis. In New York in particular, where Tierney lives, there was this fear that they'd run out of hospital beds, which was the initial thing. So they said, oh my God, we got to do something like that. So they started diverting old people to the old people's homes when they got COVID. This actually killed more people because the old people were the vulnerable ones, and putting sick people into the same building as them increased the spread among the most vulnerable members of the population. No big city ever ran out of hospital beds. It turned out, again, that was an overblown fear, exaggeration of the crisis, but the steps taken to deal with what they thought was the crisis led to more deaths. So just wrap up, what can you do about this? Avoid perfectionism, stop trying to be perfect. I mentioned my new book on the self. I read some psychopathology literature for that and was surprised how often perfectionism is associated with different kinds of psychopathologies. To make life good, start by reducing negative things. That's more important. Yes, you want to cultivate positive, but first cut down on the negatives. That'll have the bigger impact. Follow the rule of 4. Remember, try to get 4 good things. Even if you're reading bad news, then make a point of going looking for positive things that'll make you feel good. See the big picture. Remember, life is mostly good, and bad events, we do learn more from them, so you can use that. It's unfortunate when they happen, but you can learn from that. As I said, cultivate the good things. All right, time's just about up. So don't be fooled by the worst case scenarios. Those are always popular and showing up in the media and everything, but again, they're very unlikely to come true. And as we've seen with COVID, the worst case scenarios were way, way, way off from what actually happened everywhere. And as I said, in life, there's much more to celebrate than to mourn. So recognize this tendency of the mind to dwell on the bad and use it. So final thought, yes, bad is stronger than good. That's a property of the mind, but life is mostly good because there are lots of good things. And so remember to cultivate those as well as working against the bad things. Thank you.